Chris and Deon, could y'all briefly go into the two bills right now, Senate Bill 21 and House Bill 21? Chris, I'll first ask you, could you give a little bit of some background on what the current bail bills are trying to accomplish?
Sure. What SB21 and HB20 have in common is that they further entrench the criminal legal system in which the rights of liberty and the presumption of innocence are for sale, in which having or not having money determines whether or not the system allows people to be free or treats them as convicted felons. There are over 39,000 people awaiting trial in Texas jail. And in 2019, Black people made up 32% of that number. Latinx people accounted for 33%. SB21 makes pre-detention worse by adding restrictions that can make receiving personal reconnaissance bonds a lot harder. An example is that it adds restrictions for those who have failed to appear in the last 2 years while on bond. If they have an insufficient bond or if they have multiple charges, this would disqualify them from receiving a PR bond under SB21. This further forces people into cash bail regimes that are racist, classist, as Dr. Greene had said. Nationwide, we have seen Black and brown people receive bail amounts that are twice as high as the bail amount of a white person who receives the same charges. Some of the people that would be allowed to go free unless they have money under this bill are already tied to poverty. But SB1 also targets community bail funds with stringent restrictions around who can be bailed out. They put restrictions on how the amount that people will be bailed out, and it forces community bails to report to the local county and sheriff's department. An example of the limits is that they would only allow community bail funds to place $2,000 bail amounts for people that they would like to get out. And if they report to the county sheriffs, what happens if the county sheriff deems it inappropriate or not up to par, they can suspend them from being functioning in their county for up to 1 year. So SB21 and HB20 prioritization reeks of retaliation for mass protests against systemic racism, police violence, and criminal injustice after George Floyd's murder last summer. Community bail funds were instrumental in freeing many thousands of those people who were brutalized, arrested, and caged for speaking out against those protests.
What was very appalling for me was how the bill was proposed. They made it seem as if the majority of the people that are incarcerated are violent and continually to commit violent crimes. Furthermore, they are allowing violent victims to get out on bail repeatedly. And according to the statistics, they were showing that they were committing crimes that were just incomprehensible. Murders, rapes, robberies, and so forth. But what it was actually doing was showing statistics just on violent crimes, but they're not telling you that the majority of the people that are incarcerated are non-violent offenders for a variety of charges. So basically, if this bill is passed, it would target all the Black and browns, the immigrants, the poor, people that really can't help themselves. And it was really hard to watch. So just knowing this and seeing this, and myself once being in that position years ago, we definitely have to stand up and use our voices and promote change.
Yeah, I believe Deon makes a solid point that, yeah, there is lots of fear-mongering going on. And the use of Kim Mogg's testimony and her belief in saying that crime is up and associated with bail, we simply know that's not true. We know that crime is up because there's instability due to the pandemic, unemployment, housing insecurities, and other social and economic factors. Matter of fact, recently there was a report by the Justice Administrative Department for Harris County that kind of revokes or debunks Kim Mogg's claims. First, bail reform was exclusively changed pretrial practices for low-level nonviolent misdemeanor defendants. Second, bail reform occurred between 2017 and 2019. The crimes that Kim Mogg speaks of happened during the summer and mid-2020s. There's no correlation between the two. Third, similar crime trends that are exhibited in Dallas, Los Angeles, and Chicago suggest that increases in crime are caused by national level of social economic pressures rather than municipal or county level policy changes such as bail reform. Lastly, there's a monthly time series analysis that presents evidence that monthly counts of murders are better predicted by economic pressures such as unemployment and COVID-19 than by local policy. Furthermore, it deemed that bail reform may have slowed the increase in murder rates when other factors are considered. The memo closes and lets us know that other policy initiatives not relying on cash bail will be required to halt the increase in violence.
So I'm hearing you say right now, the folks who are pushing this bill, the stated objective is to say, oh, by making sure we keep people in jail on bail because they won't be able to bail out. That way we're going to help public safety because we have violent criminals that we need to keep in jail. And it sounds like what you're saying is you're calling into question the idea that this bill or our current bail system at all helps address violence or helps address public safety. And this question for both Chris and Deon. Could y'all tell me a little bit from your own personal experience, the actual impact that our current bail system has? Because this is just going to invest even more in it.
Okay, first off, for me, cash bail versus getting out. For me, I call it on recognizance from California, but it's PR here. So if you can't afford bail and you only have $500 worth of fines or charges, you literally sit in jail until you get an arraignment, and then it gets continued and so forth and so forth. Next thing you know, you've been in jail for a couple weeks, and by that time, 3 days, no call, no show, you done lost your job. Then now you can't pay rent because you don't have a job. Then you're going to be evicted, and so forth and so forth. And next thing you know, you'll literally be on the street or trying to live with a family member to get on your feet and start all over. And by that time, you're already in the system and it becomes a repetitive cycle.
I'm curious, Chris, from your personal experience, I'm also going to ask you, Pastor Greene, in your experience with Dallas County and the way that you've been working with Dallas County in our bail fund, if what Deon is saying resonates with y'all's experience as well.
Yeah, I think what Deon saying resonates very strongly with me and my experience here in Dallas County. I think Deon is right on point when he talks, for instance, about the ramifications of this, right? That, for instance, the implications that it means in terms of this person getting a job, being able to pay his or her rent. And so the whole system has broad ramifications that extend, even beyond the individual. And furthermore, if let's say that this person eventually gets bail, right? Is bonded out, and they come back and they are found innocent, they don't get their money back, right? So now, not only have they, now the situation is complicated or compounded even more. They've been stripped of some assets, right? Money that they may have borrowed from their girlfriend or from the auntie or the spouse, right? Or their friend, that's gone. And so now they're even poorer than they were when they went in. So I think Deon is exactly right, and that's one of the things that I think that makes this system so tenacious and so immoral.
And I'd also like to add that Dr. Greene and Deon are correct that it doesn't decrease the violence, it actually increases it, because the collateral consequences that happen by potentially losing employment and losing housing security and losing custody of children. Essentially what pretrial detention does is creates poverty because it increases the crime. It causes these conditions for people to be stuck in, and evidence has shown that they have shown that increases in unemployment rates could be associated with increases in the murder rate. So if we're putting these people in these conditions, we're constantly putting in this vicious cycle, and it also depletes and siphons money from them, because if these people aren't working, they're not creating wealth, and essentially they need this wealth to be released out of jail. So it's just a constant cycle of poverty that bail systems create.
Curious, Ben, I know that this is kind of your area of expertise too, and starting to speak a little bit towards not just interpersonal ideas of violence and really getting stuck in that, which these bills currently do. I'm curious if you can start us into a conversation on if the folks who are really trying to push Senate Bill 21 and really trying to make sure House Bill 20 pass, and they're really trying to anchor it in the idea of you should be afraid because if this doesn't pass, we will let violent people on the street. Yeah, the ways that sidesteps the ideas of structural violence. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the issue of cash bail in particular kind of opens up for us also this broader truth about what I've learned to refer to as the criminal punishment system. So it's true for cash bail, and it's also true for the system more broadly. But as both Chris and Deon have lifted up here, and I think Dr. Greene said the same thing, that it not only is pretrial detention not reducing or preventing violence, but it's actually encouraging it. And this is true, though, of incarceration broadly, that if we actually care about addressing violence, then if our policymakers in the state legislature and locally, if they care about addressing violence, if that was really the issue, right? Because remember as well, the fear mongering about these dangerous figures, there's a racialized history here as well, right? That the figure of the monster, of the dangerous individual that threatens society, that is a risk, a threat to public safety. These are racial, there's histories of racialization here, right? And in particular around the criminalization of Blackness in particular. So the idea that we need to put people in cages because it will keep us safe, that it will reduce violence and solve violence, if that was true, we would have taken care of violence already. As a nation, we spend over $100 billion every year on the prison system. And in Dallas alone, right, as we know, between the county and between the city, on a yearly basis, we spend $1 billion, almost $1 billion locking people up. And yet we know that horrible things are still happening. And lots of harm is going unaddressed. In fact, it's about 2/3 of people who actually experience harm never even call on the system at all. And those who do call on the system, very few of those people actually end up being incarcerated anyways. So with this idea that we're doing something right now to address violence is just, it's not true. There's lots of harm happening in the world around us, and we're actually not addressing it. So if you wanted to address it, then you would go for the root causes of so much of the harm in our society, which we know is all the various forms of inequity that are really at the root of a lot of harm. And that's just talking about interpersonal harm. When you talk about the structural harm, Joe, that you were setting up, it is one thing, right, to think about harm that happens interpersonally, let's say a robbery or assault or something like this. But what the politicians are often telling us in terms of being afraid of that is they direct our gaze just to these instances of violence and turn away from all the ways in which all this structural violence is occurring. So if policymakers wanted to reduce harm and prevent it, they would create policies which address the causes of violence. They would be, everybody in Texas right now, in the state legislature would be working to guarantee housing. If they cared about violence, they'd be working to guarantee housing. They'd be working to guarantee healthcare. They'd be working to guarantee people have food, living wage jobs, transportation, education, all of these things, right? But that's not But somehow violence only comes up when we're talking about the prison system. Yeah. And yet all the things we know that drive violence go unaddressed. Daniel Surratt has this wonderful, wonderful quotation in her book called Until We Reckon. Violence, Mass Incarceration, or Road to Repair, I believe is the title of it. And Daniel Surratt runs a restorative justice program in New York City called Common Justice. And what Daniel Surratt says is that on an interpersonal level, the things that research shows create violence, that drive violence, are 4 factors: shame, isolation, an inability to meet one's economic needs, and an exposure to violence. Those are the 4 factors. And what are the characteristics of being incarcerated? Shame, isolation, an inability to meet one's economic needs, and exposure to violence. And what Daniel Surratt points out is we have literally baked into our so-called solution to violence the very things that drive it. And things begin to be a lot clearer when you begin to understand that that's because this system is not, that's not why it exists. We could talk a bit more about that, but it was not intended ever to address violence. So I'll pause there for now.
Thank you, Ben. I'm curious, Chris, Deon, Pastor Greene, any thoughts in following up with what Ben's saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to, and some of us are, reframing this whole narrative about what is violence, right? We need to understand that violence is also sort of baked into social policies that neglect human needs, so that economic inequality is a form of violence. Joblessness is a form of violence. Lack of health care is a form of violence. And so I think, certain powers that be like to, as Ben says, to force our gaze in one direction, right? Where we're just talking about interpersonal violence and not talking about the relationship between interpersonal violence and systematic violence that's reflected in policies at all. And so I think that we need to name violence for what violence is, and that it is extraordinarily violent for people to be living in poverty, for people not to be able to find, a place to lay their head, for people to be going to bed hungry at night, for people not to have health care. That to me is violence. And so stopping violence is also a big part of public policy, and working on and advocating and fighting for public policies that are in effect anti-violence, and policies that in effect respect human dignity.
And really just take ownership to say, consciously, we are throwing people away. So as legislators, and even us people that do all the voting and voting these people in, we've already reached enough is enough. So now what do we do as a joint venture, as a team, kind of what we're doing now, and arming ourselves with what we need to do in order to create change. But the real problem is change is uncomfortable. So most people don't want to change. If you just think about yourselves, you don't want to change certain things, but you can't grow without change. So for that being said, we have to be willing to help one another and create the change.
Yeah, I just want to add one more piece to that. Repeat violent offenders, thing that Kim Ogg kept mentioning. I think that's been disproven by researchers tracking the Harris County misdemeanor bail system. They found that people who were granted PR bonds, the percentage of defendants arrested for new crimes within that year of arrest went down. So this idea that these people are constantly going to repeat offenders are actually very small numbers. And to kind of echo what Deon said, that people have to remember that 70% of people arrested for felonies are charged with nonviolent offenses. So these numbers that the DA spoke upon are very small incidences that would penalize overall the majority of people who would benefit from PR bonds.
So I'm hearing you say that it's not only immoral and unjust, but the talking points in support of Senate Bill 21 and House Bill 20 are empirically incorrect, is what I'm hearing you say. Is that right?
Yes, according to the study that was released, and it was actually on the Texas Tribune, and I know some of the Harris County Justice Administrative Department memo also echoes some of those findings.
You know, one other quick thing that comes to mind to me that Deon is uplifting, I think, is the way in which this is profit. And profit, I think, is useful because it helps us understand too that the criminal legal system is an industry, and there's a lot of money to be made in it. And that the bigger context, right, the broader historical context in which we got to the prison system that we have now was the era of de-industrialization in, broadly the 70s until today. So the era of de-industrialization, the loss of a lot of jobs, and then new jobs through the construction of jails and through the staffing of those jails. Also, obviously, the racialized backlash against civil rights to the civil rights movement and gains in that, as well as counterinsurgency. There's another really, really good book called Incarcerating the Crisis, I believe is the title, that details this context for how this was really a counterinsurgency, state counterinsurgency strategy to contain all of these different liberation movements that were moving, these different social movements that were actively pushing for a radical transformation of society throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And because if you go back to the 70s, to the era before mass incarceration, there were about 200,000 people incarcerated across the nation. You move forward to today, there are over 2.3 million people. That is a huge, huge increase in the number of people incarcerated. And no, we're not any safer. No, we're not. Our communities are not safer. Our communities are not better. If anything, people have more economic insecurity. People tend to feel less, are experiencing more insecurity and less safety. So it's also important to understand that this is an industry. And part of what a cash bail provides is a ready supply of people to enter into and be recycled into this industry, this system again and again. And it's profitable. It's profitable for that to be the case. So there's a reason why we're not actually seeing this system solve any of the things that we're told it's supposed to solve, because that's not the purpose. It needs this ready supply of lives and people to be consumed, to be commodified, and to be ground up.
I'm wondering if any of y'all could speak to the impact that not being able to bail out has on somebody. To be somebody who's truly impacted by one of these bills. What are the recurring impacts that we've seen in the community or even within our own congregations?
I think for one, just the financial impact that pretrial detention has. It strips wealth and capital from Black and Brown communities, and the amount usually is between anywhere from $55,000 to $99,000 in economic benefits that a person who is detained, and by extension their families and the communities, have lost this wealth. And we see this as them losing their employment, losing the housing, and being stuck in jail. And it costs $65 a day to have these people in jail. I believe that's the current rate. So it not only does it penalize the person, but also penalizes the community, because then we have to pay for all this, instead of allowing that person to be out on their personal recognizance.
That's helpful, Chris. Any more thoughts on the current line of thought we have before I read this question from Nancy?
One just quick addition to that as well is that I think as we look at how not only to oppose these specific bills, but then also to continue the work, the organizing work around ending pretrial detention, that we also need to be keeping our eyes on the ways in which pretrial services, so if people are released, the way in which the kinds of pretrial services that we want are going to be supportive ones, not ones that are punitive, because even if you are released pre-trial, let's say but there are some sort of conditions to your release. So maybe it's through an electronic monitor, or through or something like an overnight or 24-hour curfews or things like that. These conditions, these are punitive conditions, and they also make it harder for people and their loved ones to survive and thrive. And you see the same things that Chris just uplifted in terms of this makes it more likely that it's going to be harder to maintain a secure, stable housing, loss of job. This often is a difficult thing as well. The electronic monitoring can be a difficult thing for families if there are conditions where the household that the person with the electronic monitor is at can't have anybody who's on parole or something like that. That often this divides families, forces individuals to live with relatives who may not want them in the house, and so on. So there's all these sorts of ways in which this web of control, of pretrial control and supervision is not just even about the cage itself. It's also, we have to keep our eyes on the ways in which control and supervision extends through these other networks and webs as well of the system.
So this question from Nancy is coming in saying, what should we push our state legislators to support and pass to address the cycle of poverty and criminalization of Black and brown communities? And if it's hard to think of an answer from like a policy perspective of, oh, there's House Bill whatever, or this exact, policy shortfall, maybe even if you could answer that, y'all, from speaking from the question of, what do you wish you were reading on a headline in the newspaper that the lawmakers in Austin were trying to take up?
Well, I mean, I think we kind of touched upon those. I think if they had better rental assistance programs, emergency rental assistance programs, instead of directing COVID-19 relief money to law enforcement, that money should be going to debt relief and student debt relief and things that really uplift the community and not penalizes them. I would wish that the first thing I saw was that they're granting, free tuition for all students, or they're closing so many jails and they're opening so many libraries, because these things are real. COVID-19 has switched our importance on things. Like now, I think surveillance is more important than actually educating people and keeping them housed in prisons instead of keeping them housed in their actual homes. And so it's just addressing issues like that. Even simple things where like in Austin, where they make camping illegal, which we see as an attack on people who can't afford to be and afford housing, so things like that. If we need to roll back those things, and we need to keep the community pressure and just keep people aware that these things are going constantly, and it's at a local level, and it's going to be at the federal level, and it's going to be at the state level. It's always around us, and there's always these modes of oppression steamrolling people, and it's just subtle things and slowly, and it's just when we don't see this is happening, this is when they exaggerate these kind of laws, and this is what's happening now.
That's super helpful. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on what you wish you were watching the legislature passing right now?
I agree with Christopher. I think that those are some of the things we need to be seeing. We need to be seeing more activity in the area of affordable housing, more activity in the area of healthcare, more activity in the area of paid leave. And we need to be, I just think we need to frame this as an anti-violence program, right? And that and continue to seize the take the initiative, right? Then this is how you fight violence, right? You fight violence by making sure that people have affordable housing. You're interested in fighting violence? Well, you fight violence by ensuring that that people have paid family leave. Are you interested in fighting violence? You fight violence by making sure that people have access to health care, right? And I think that's the approach that we need to take, because this is the way I think ultimately we have to fight violence. And so yes, I think Christopher is exactly right. It's going to cost money, but let's not pretend that what's going on right now isn't costing money. It's
Mm.
costing a lot of money. And on top of that, I think Christopher may have mentioned this previously, you have the extraction of wealth from Black and brown communities as a result of this. And then you have non-monetary costs, things that's hard to quantify, the effect that that has on the individual's family and in the broader community. So yeah, I mean, there's a cost to doing something, but there's also a cost to not doing something. And the cost of not doing something is often substantially higher than the cost of doing something.
As a local community organizer who has a framework of thinking about the world, is if you want to shift national dialogue, hyper local organizing is a strong leverage point and pathway for that. So I love how you said it, intervening on violence, stopping violence. We don't have to build all the way statewide power just to do that. We can go to our city council and start that work tomorrow, which is what Faith in Texas is doing. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I love that. I love that reframing the work that we're doing as we are trying to prevent violence. We are fighting back against violence and intervening on violence. And we're doing that by pushing for affordable housing, because this is the way that you get entangled in our criminal justice system that is seeking to entangle, needs to be having people entangled in it. I love it. I love it. What does it mean as people of faith for us when our lawmakers are trying to pass laws that tempt us, encourage us, and trap us into dehumanizing our neighbors? How do we see that playing a role in our sacred text? How do we see our unique voice in that?
Okay, so I'm going to jump in. All right. I think that one of the things that is useful for us to do is to look at times and events in history where people drew upon their faith and it provided a powerful resource for imagining something different than what is, right? So I would say, for instance, the abolitionist movement, and to see how they drew upon, religious language, religious imagery, the faith tradition to challenge slavery. So I think likewise, we have to, really mine and think about the ways in which our religious traditions provide an invaluable resource to fighting against this sort of, prison industrial complex. And that we have to, ask ourselves, what does it mean to at least have the imagination of being an abolitionist in this space? What does that look like, and how does my faith tradition play into that? And so I think that there are historical examples of ways in which different social movements have drawn upon their religious tradition and the resources to push a powerful image that results in emancipating people from something that's evil, or something that's, we might say something that's demonic. And I think that we have to think along those same lines. I mean, what does it look like to when we imagine ourselves as abolitionists in the 21st century, and with looking at this, prison industrial complex and people being caged in, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that it begins with at least being willing to entertain the possibility and expanding our imaginations to take that into account.
I really appreciate that, and I'm gonna ask another question to the group. After saying this, I love your perspective on that, because I honestly, without my faith tradition, I don't know if I could start to imagine something outside of this world, something that is different from what we have.
If for those of you who don't know, I'm one of the Live Free organizers at Faith in Texas. my organizing focuses on precisely the issues we're talking about today, which is how we dismantle the prison industrial complex and how do we actually invest in our communities in ways that create real safety. And I also come at this work from a background of both a MDiv degree, a Master's of Divinity. There's a time in my life where I thought I would be pursuing this organizing work, shall you say, in a ministerial context, and also a PhD in religion and culture, where a lot of my research and work has focused on the ways in which specific forms of Christianity, in particular, the Christianity that was forged in the projects of colonialism and of capitalism and white supremacy, that these forms of Christianity that in many ways we inhabit ourselves, even as we struggle against them, that these really drove the construction of all of the systems of inequity that we're living under right now. And in many ways, they continue to animate them, right? So there is, I think, a particular responsibility for us to recognize the ways. For me, I come out of, I'm rooted in the Christian tradition, specifically shaped by the Christian liberation movements and theologies. And I think that those of us who are specifically rooted within the Christian context, we learn to believe in punishment in many ways in our churches. And we've learned to believe deeply in that punishment and in retribution. And so what I think the hope for us at the same time is that Christianity has also been practiced differently. And people of faith as Dr. Greene, more broadly, as Dr. Greene uplifted, have drawn on their faith as a resource for radically critiquing the present and radically doing something new that goes beyond the present. And also just as a point of hope too. When I mentioned, for example, that in the 70s, the prison population was about 200,000 and people were actively talking about what would come next after the end of the prison. And the prison system itself is not even 200 years old. The policing as an institution is not even 200 years old. There was a time before. So though it is so unimaginable to us in many ways because of how deeply those who are invested in the current forms of inequity have been in spreading the ideologies that we have internalized, the logic of oppression that we've internalized, that's been intentional. Just as an example of that, the Los Angeles Police Department, I believe it was the Los Angeles Police Department in 1955, that was the first time that police began to use the slogan to protect and serve. And that's been protect and serve, public safety, all these messages about why we have police, that's a PR strategy. Before 1955, the police were very clear that their purpose was to target and control racialized populations that were considered to be dangerous or in need of control in some way, as well as the surplus populations of capital, the parts of the working class that had to be unemployed, because in order for capitalism to be profitable, there has to be a certain number, labor costs have to be kept down. And how you do that is there have to be some people unemployed. There has to be some disposable population, right? So this is that's why the police exist. It's the reason why there's not safety actually being created. The reason why there's so much harm happening, right? And let's think about this too in terms of all the ways in which harm gets ignored. Why in the Texas state capitol right now, they're talking about these bills about cash bail and pre-trial, but nobody's saying anything about, let's say, for example, hey, maybe we should, if we're really concerned about sexual violence, maybe we have to actually shut down the fraternities across Texas. I mean, nobody's actually going for the places. The thing is, we know that a lot of harm is occurring. And the reality is, like I said, 2/3 of people don't even call on this system. And Daniel Surratt, in her book, I think she uses the analogy of you're in a desert and there's this hamburger stand. And there's a line at the hamburger stand because that's the only place you can eat because you're in a desert. But the food is terrible. The hamburgers are terrible. They'll make you sick, but some people are still getting it because it's all there is. But the majority of people are still passing it by. And our prison system is that terrible hamburger that some people will go to because we've been told, for one, there is no other way to deal with really serious harm. And two, so we're given no other option, and it's a bad option, and it doesn't address the things. But still, even that bad option, 2/3 of people who experience harm don't choose it. And another thing to remember with respect to for me, with respect to, you know what, let me pause for a minute, because I'm about to go into a little sermonic monologue here, and I want to make sure that others have space as well. But I want to speak to some of the other ways in which, for me as a Christian, why my own faith commitments keep me in the direction of freedom, and in the direction of responding to the very real harms that occur in ways that promote restoration, repair, and transformation.
The only thing I really have is, as I was listening to him, you know, by me being in a management background, project management, and so forth, I always think about root cause analysis. What's causing it, and why is it happening, and how do we fix it? So we understand the poverty, we understand mass incarceration, and what's going on with the homeless community and whatnot. So just thinking about a few things, we know what's happening and what we need to do to fix it. It's not that simple, but at the same time, you can clearly see if we provide housing, some mental health facilities that we took away, that's what created most of the homelessness and poverty that we have. So I was listening to him throwing out the numbers, 250,000 inmates. I'm not sure which year that was, but I know for a fact, because I'm one, how it multiplied so fast. And that's because we don't have any true reform. 85% of people that are incarcerated, they go back to prison. And the reason that is because when you're getting out of prison, they didn't prepare you to come back to society. And then when you go to find a job, depending on your background, you don't qualify. So you get in a situation to where you're out on prison, no job, no place to live, depending on how long, or your family, or whatever the case may be. So at that point, you're homeless, and then you commit a simple crime and you're right back in. But my instance, for example, if I can be transparent and say, you know, I'm out on probation or parole, or however you want to call it, but my entire family is felons. Everyone I know is felon. The community I lived in was full of felons, but if the condition of your parole is you can't be around any known felons, there's no way out of that. So when you get violated for being with your father, visiting, and you go back to prison because you visited your father to check on his well-being, that's a violation of your parole. You're back in prison. So that's just one example of how it happens and how it's going to continue to happen, because it's not about the individuals. It's about the numbers that have to be incarcerated in order to generate the income. And it's a travesty, but the only way we're going to be able to change that is if we as individuals collectively stand up and say, it has to change. We have to create different laws and bills to favor not just the Black and brown, but everybody as a whole.
That resonates with me. And it just speaks to this, entire system, and that how difficult it is to extricate yourself from it once you're trapped in it, even if you're trapped in it for a month or, or anything like that. And so I do think that it also underscores the importance of us thinking, more broadly about where it is we want to go, and how does fighting against SB 21 and these various bills, play a role in taking us to where we want to go, taking us to where, Ben says, there's something that's more transformative and restorative. Because the fact of the matter is this: if we were to release tomorrow everyone who is sitting in prison simply because they can't pay bail, and we let them all go, the fact of the matter is that this nation would still have probably the highest incarceration rate of any other developed country, right? So, that's not to deny the importance of talking about reformation of the cash bail system, other things like that, but it is remind us that we are really dealing with a very entrenched and very powerful system. Well, if I said Monday, if I could wave my hand and say, all right, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, everybody sitting in jail, nonviolent, everybody, all nonviolent offenders sitting in jail, simply because they can't pay bail, you're released. And we did that across the country, we would still be talking about a nation that incarcerates millions of people. And so I think, again, it underscores and sort of tagging into what Ben is saying and some others are saying, is really thinking about, what is our vision? Where is it that we want to go more broadly? And how are the things that we're doing contributing to that? And how are some of the policies that are being proposed making it more difficult for us to get to that vision?
I love, oh goodness. There's something now that that I think with respect both to what Dr. Greene just said and to what Deon said as well. I mean, I'm thinking also about this reality when you just look at the empirical information of well, we know that in Dallas County, for example, there's a 50% recidivism rate. And Deon mentioned the 80%, 86%. I believe that's a state, Deon, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's state prison figure, right? That it's like 5 out of 6 people end up rearrested. And yeah, okay. And I think that's, and there's another thing, I think, to me, the question that comes to mind is what, we usually look at that as if it is a measure of the ineffectiveness of the prison industrial complex. But what if that's the point? What if a 50% recidivism rate? What if an 86% recidivism rate? What if that's the point? I think we have to move, we have got to be, those of us in particular who are rooted in faith traditions, we have got to unlearn this logic of punishment, and we have got to disbelieve these things we've been told, that inflicting suffering and harm on people is supposed to provide safety, that putting people in cages is supposed to be doing something that is rehabilitative, or that, on all the things that we're told about deterrence, rehabilitation, all these things, right? I understand. I don't think you have to be merciful. It's not about mercy. I honestly, mercy to me is not the question. The question is, I don't know how you solve violence by, one, continuing to create the structural conditions that foster a violence, the kind of economic insecurity, the things that Dr. Greene uplifted, right? That it's violent to deny people healthcare, it's violent to deny them housing, it's violent to deny a living wage. But I don't know how you would address interpersonal violence through meeting it with state violence, and also why we don't see state violence, incarceration itself, as violent. And we also, as people of faith, we have got to reject the idea that there are certain people, we don't believe in monsters. I don't believe in monsters. My faith commits me to the belief that nobody is disposable. And that means that what it means, if nobody is disposable, it also means a responsibility, an active responsibility for us as people of faith and as communities to deal with, develop skills, and to deal with the very real ways in which we do harm to each other. And also to recognize, right? For women who are incarcerated, it's a wild stat. It's something along the lines of 96% of women who are incarcerated in state prisons are themselves survivors of sexual violence. This idea that there are this group of people over here who do harm, and then this group of people over here who experience harm, is not true. The punishment system, what it does is it captures people at one point in time and says, you did this thing, and you are now therefore violent. You're a violent criminal or something like that. What we know is nearly everybody who is incarcerated for a so-called violent crime has themselves experienced violence. And so when you look at it in the broader context of harm, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense why you wouldn't, to address it, to get to the root, why you wouldn't deal with that reality that we are, depending on the timeline that you're looking at different points, experiencing harm or doing harm. And one thing I want to say is I need to, we're getting close to a rapid thing, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I want us to, there's this story from, for me as a Christian at least, I don't think that Christians in particular, and I think this is true more generally of those of faith communities more broadly as well, is that you can't think about the punishment system that the way the SB21 wants you to think about it. Because not only as a Christian, I don't believe in punishment, I don't believe in criminals, I don't believe in monsters, like I said, because my God is a criminal. We shouldn't be easy audiences for judges, cops, this idea that certain people are risks to public safety and dangerous, because for me, if my God was always on this other side, was always the risk to public safety, the flight risk, the dangerous, the problem, and we should be immediately suspicious when people who benefit from the existing systems of inequity tell us to see certain people as inherently monstrous and dangerous, as if risk is this thing that exists inside of individuals and is not in fact about the context in which individuals exist. And in the Gospel of Matthew, there's, if you're familiar with in the Christian Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, there's this story about, this is right before the crucifixion of Jesus. And Pontius Pilate is the one who's the governor of Judea. He has the power to actually sentence Jesus to be crucified or not. He has the power to make this decision or not. And there's a story about how Pontius Pilate's wife sends him this warning not to execute Jesus because she's had this troubling dream about it. And yet Pilate feels this pressure from those calling for punishment. And he gives permission for Jesus to be punished and crucified. But what he does is he washes his hands in water. He claims that that he's innocent of the responsibility. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to SB21 and HB20 and these bad bail bills, this is the role that our state and our local politicians are playing when they talk about violence and why we need these punitive bail laws and why we need to spend money on police and prisons. They are playing the role of Pilate. They are washing their hands, and they have the power to invest in solutions that would reduce harm. Housing, jobs, education, and so on. But the thing is, America's truest religion is capitalism and white supremacy. And the criminal punishment system provides the ritual sacrifice of millions of lives for the sake of the profit of the few, again and again. This 50% recidivism, that's the point. 86% recidivism, that's the point. It's a ritual sacrifice. And the criminal punishment system, especially the police, these are idols. The criminal punishment system is an idol to which we have been turned, and to which we have been told to bow down, and to which we sacrifice the lives of millions in the name of some version of safety that somehow never arrives. And there is a better pathway forward. And I would encourage all of us who are genuinely looking then for that better pathway to do a couple of things. One is you can make demands, as we are going to be doing on the local level, to have your local governments be cutting police and prison budgets and using that money to invest in community programs. You can also, I would highly, highly encourage you that if you want to know how do we actually create real safety, I'm going to drop a couple of links into the chat. I encourage you to look into the transformative justice movement. I encourage you to look into restorative justice. I encourage you to read this book right here, and I will happily read it with you and study it with you, called We Do This Till We Free Us, that Miriam Kava just released recently, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. It is not that there is not ways for us as people of faith to believe in and practice a better world. It's that we have to do it. We have to do it. And a lot of lives depend on it. But the thing is, I believe we will win. I do. That's part of, for me, a part of the faith of this too, is it may not come in our lifetime, but I believe we will win.
This is not just about Senate Bill 21. This is about pushing back and intervening on violence, the violence that's already in our systems, to redirect the entire idea that this is where the conversation begins, and this is where the battle lines are drawn. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you all a few links and a few ways that you can take action. Each one of these points of action, y'all, are a little step up from each other, okay? So the first thing that you can do is you can sign a petition. The reason that that's there is because not everybody has a ton of time to do all the things during this legislative session, this short, high, fast legislative session, when we have the opportunity to start doing narrative work, where the state legislature has given us the opportunity and shown the ugliness of the system by trying to pass these laws. This is an opportunity. So in this moment, you can sign a petition. And the reason that the petition is important is because when we go talk to lawmakers and are pushing this narrative, we need to be able to say, it's not just us who believe this. We're bringing the voices of so many more. Because it doesn't really matter how right we are, it matters how much power we have to get things done. And to be able to demonstrate that there's more people with us is important. On that note of having to have more people with us, we have this tool at Faith in Texas called the Rapid Action Network. The Rapid Action Network is a glorified text tree, but it is gloriful. It is beautiful, y'all. So the Rapid Action Network, if you go through the training at that link that you're seeing on, and it's on our website too. You go to our website, click get involved, you'll see that link. You can join a team where the folks who are in the Capitol and in the back rooms and know when things move quicker than the general public does, let us know when something is happening and when we need to flood offices with calls. And not just offices in general, but which exact offices in this moment need to get about 100, 200 calls. So join the Rapid Action Network and you can get that message where you can make that call, and within 24 hours, we'll have flooded those offices in ways that you can't really do without they call it under the dome, in the Capitol know-how and intel. The next level of action, if you're like, I want to do that, but I want to do more, write a letter to your House representative. The current political landscape is that these bills do really well in the Senate, but we have the opportunity to stop these in the House. So specifically leaning on your House representatives, if you worship or pray or there's an institution of faith or congregation that you pertain to, don't just call your personal representative, but write a letter also to your congregational representative saying, I worship here, I go here every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and my voice matters too in your district. There's a link here next to it that will walk you through the different steps to writing these letters makes it really, really easy, right? It's a lot of it is just very easy plug and play, but it's still very personalized. There's instructions at the bottom of that link too on who to send your letter to in this moment, and that link will continue to be updated throughout legislative session based on the political landscape, but the content will never change. Of the letter will never change. The people who you're sending it to may. So keep checking in back in on that too. The last thing is read your letter on social media and tag both Faith in Texas and your representative. If you do write a letter, take a video of yourself, go Facebook Live, put it on Instagram, put that video up there and make sure you're tagging your representative, because right now with COVID, it's really, really, really hard to be in touch with representatives because the Capitol is shut down in so many ways. A lot of people are not taking office visits. Social media is still a direct line to so many different representatives. Take your letter, write it, go through the steps in that link that says Senate Bill 21 letter writing template, and then just press that one little button on your phone and drop that video.